in a couple of cases vendors that wouldn't tell us anything about that. We would guess. We would get the engineering guy and like just like throw random, is it? What do you think? BPSK? What do you say? Like just don't say anything if I'm right, And he would sort of cough or something. And so when you have that kind of scenario, what we found is that we found some really neat things from patent data. FCC ID lookups are really good. There was one case where we looked at a vendor where there's actually there's a place in your FCC application for your radio where you can say, please don't disclose this information because it's proprietary trade secret, and then they just did it anyway. So it's like the letter that says, please don't tell anybody our hopping algorithm, and then like the next exhibit in the FCC data is the hopping algorithm. And yeah, so all the EMI test report data and everything else out of the FCC tells us a lot about what the radios do. And actually we'll get to this on a victim radio here in a second. We also found that looking at and actually, for what it's worth, firmware extraction in this case for us, like a lot of times, didn't help because this is typically stuff being done on board, so that the firmware will have something like a draw unicorns function that just talks to the radio, and then all that stuff's happening in a lot of cases in hardware. The firmware might tell us about the larger protocol that's it's communicated on and stuff, but to get to the radios, we're usually looking at ICs and RF modules on the board itself. So yeah, and then actually you can go pull the vendor bios and resumes and things like that.
Start looking at job postings and things like that, saying it would be great if you had specific expertise in blah. Oh, now I know what you're. Yeah, that's it. Right
we're looking for somebody with GFSK experience, whatever it might be. So, so this is actually a digi board that is basically a SCADA RF relay or serial RF relay. You could use it for lots of other stuff too, but like these get used for utility kind of stuff. So what most of these will have when you get down onto the board is there's RF shielding that the FCC requires, and that's usually what they put there, little pretty sticker. And on there's obviously the FCC ID. Usually you'll see that on the outside. We just looked at when we walked up here, we looked at our microphones and wrote the number down on those. So we're, if you lose signal later today, we're terribly sorry. But yeah, you usually pull the FCC ID, and then once we pop. Once we pull that off, from the FCC test information, in this case, for example, it tells us the radio's range. It tells us actually the dwell time per channel, and channel width and things like that. And also, in their case, the modulation type, which may or may not actually be accurate, in some cases. But yeah, once we pop shielding off one of these devices, don't look at, I'm sorry I didn't desolder it. I was upstairs and I only had a screwdriver. If you pull that IC and, a lot of cases, maybe you need a magnifying glass or something like that, you pull those IC numbers, you'll get a data sheet. And in a lot of cases, the RFIC will literally tell you, like, for example, how to drive it, over the bus, if you want to do that, but also the modulation types supported, the clock rates and the bit rates. And when we demodulate this data and try to turn it into zeros and ones, that's what we need. We need all of those values to match up to what the radio originally sent. Yeah.
Right, so this is just a snapshot of what we were talking about, of mapping the entire ISM band, right? So every single one of those peaks you see on the top, every one of those is a channel burst. So that's a burst somewhere within that hop. We're, in this example, specifically focusing on one channel. That's the one that's got the blue that's coming up right there. And then on the bottom side is that being decoded. So focusing on that individual channel just for this graphic, what pops out at the bottom, right, is roughly zeros and ones. There'll be some sort of encoding or decoding that may need to happen, so it may not be exactly a 0 or a 1, but you're now very close, and then oftentimes it's identical.
Yeah, well, and that's, in clock recovery and soft bit stuff, what's happening, because radio is not, on the other side of it, I just told you it was like Ethernet, so it's not like Ethernet, right? So, the voltage on a wire can go, very predictably to really clear levels, right? But in the case of radio, with signal and bleed and interference and all that, it's going to be more like a curve. So usually what's happening is you're looking at the symbol rate, and then you're converting that to, that's going to map to some number that's closer to 0, closer to 1, ultimately. So yeah, I don't know, can anybody, know what that is? Is it like B's or C's, or it says, yeah. But yeah, that's kind of it on the other side of it. Like that's what the, as Nathan said, what the channel we're watching, like what that maps out to.
So yeah, talked about this a little bit earlier. This is just a zoom in on one individual burst and what that looks like. The way, so what this is actually drawing is an averaging of lots of samples over a short period of time that are then showing you exactly where, well, I guess where that signal is. And so it's always in a constant flux between basically these two different, or it's averaging to two different frequencies that it then shifts between to represent that data that we just saw in the previous one.
Yeah. Like 0 minutes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, yeah, ultimately on the other side of it, like we say, when we can do wideband interception, the FHSS piece, depending on how many radios are in use, and there's obviously some challenges if there's a lot of traffic, but if we have a single sample, at the end of the day, that's sequential, right? That took place over time, and when we break that out, right, it ends up being, say IP traffic. It's got headers in session information, all that stuff there. We don't really care if we followed the hops around. It's not necessarily relevant to us. But yeah, you still need to identify the modulation scheme, encoding, symbol rate, big endian, little endian, lots of other stuff. It's really hard. Yeah, and so yeah, so pretty much once you've started with your sample, and ideally it's a situation where you can generate traffic, what you basically then are doing is spending a bunch of time taking those samples and throwing different demodulation types and different kinds of math at it based on the things that you could guess from the ICs, and you could try to extract from whatever other sources you could find to get it as close as you can. And when actual data comes out, then you know that you got it right. So,
wrap up.
Yeah, and that's and yeah, I will make kind of this point too that in a lot of cases you might, and actually with some of our stuff with Zigbee, like we mentioned that there isn't necessarily a really easy SEP stack yet for us. We still could do a lot of testing with Zigbee because if we could just generate traffic, just general purpose traffic, we didn't necessarily have to know at a packet construction level what exactly was going on. So even if we have bits, if we know what those bits are doing, it still gives us something, right? Yeah, and obviously, especially if there's no other any other kind of timing or other sequence pieces in place, and we can just directly replay that data, then we may not even care. We don't really necessarily need to even break it apart. Yeah, and yeah, in some cases that may mean that you could follow hop sequences and hit it at the right value and brute force FHSS. Oh crap, we're out of time. Sorry. Yeah, and so yeah, related to just general other stuff with a lot of these proprietary radios is they have something like a BSS ID in authentication and things like that. A lot of times that's just a number that's in firmware and doesn't do any other validation.
Right.
So there may be something like a ProMISC mode somewhere in firmware that you can flip on. So if you have control of the radio itself, it may just sniff for you, right? Yeah, may just allow, default settings might allow anybody to join. So.
Yeah, so just a summary of everything we've talked about so far. We like standards. We like real crypto that's been actually looked at by people in the industry and by people smarter than all of us. Pay attention to AMISec. Go out and look at some of their stuff. I know there's people here that are members of AMISec. We'd like to plug it. It's good work where they're going. Utilities, yeah. Yeah, utilities really need to push. They're the ones that have the money in this particular thing, so they're the ones that ultimately can get things fixed, right?
Yeah, well, and actually on the other side of that too, and presumably not everybody in this room is from the utility sector. I mean, we as consumers too, you need to ask questions. I know we were on site for a particular utility, and they had an email that made the rounds that went to like their contact us web form, and the person who sent the email just happened to be a cryptographer and asked a bunch of questions about what are they doing with
AMI. It went all the way up to the CEO and all around. So yeah. I know that people are paying attention.
Yeah.
So
yeah, ask those questions as a consumer.